From the heart of Africa, Burkina Faso shines anew.
The Africa spoke. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful African stories.
If I told you there's a country in Africa building an airport more advanced than some in the United States, would you believe me? Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa, is undergoing a transformation that's catching the world off guard. Under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the pace of change is nothing short of electrifying. New airports are taking shape with sleek designs and faster runways. Highways are cutting travel time in half, and trade routes are opening like never before. But here's the thing. These projects aren't just about concrete and steel. They're a signal, a bold statement that Burkina Faso is no longer content to play catch-up. It's stepping onto the global stage with the kind of confidence that demands attention. And yet, this is only the surface. What's happening behind the walls of its universities might surprise you even more. Step through the gates of one of Burkina Faso's public universities, and the first thing you notice isn't the size, it's the atmosphere. The campus is alive with movement. Students huddle under the shade of towering trees, laughter spilling into the open walkways, and the buildings, they're unlike anything you've seen in an American college town. Here's the twist. Most of these structures are built with locally sourced materials, mud brick and laterite stone. Not imported glass and steel, but designs that breathe with the climate. They're cool under the fierce Sahel sun, resilient in the face of heavy rains, and they stand as a quiet reminder that innovation doesn't always mean importing foreign ideas. Now, let's talk numbers. Tuition here for a full year of study? Around 15,000 CFA francs. That's about $25 US. Yes, you heard that right, $25. In the US, that barely covers a single textbook, let alone a year's education. If you grew up in America paying $30,000 a year for college, how does this make you feel? Does it challenge the way you think about education and accessibility? Drop your thoughts below because I'm curious if you believe quality education can exist without a sky-high price tag. And as we wander deeper into the campus, there's something else, something hidden in plain sight that will change how you see this place entirely. Meet Godwin, a lecturer who once sat in these same classrooms as a student. He learned English right here, in a country where French dominates. Today, he teaches diplomacy and communications, mentoring the next generation of Burkina Faso leaders. He tells me something that stops me in my tracks. Students here, if they're nationals, don't pay what you'd call tuition fees, just a registration fee, 15,000 CFA a year. Unless you're in a professional master's program, and even then, it's rarely more than 400,000 CFA. For most families, this is within reach. Let's pause. In America, 400,000 CFA, about $650, is less than the monthly rent in most college towns. Here, it buys you a master's degree. What does that say about priorities? What does it say about who gets access to opportunity? And there's more. Godwin points out a cluster of new amphitheaters rising beside decades-old lecture halls. They didn't bulldoze the old ones, they kept them. They've resisted the temptation to erase history, instead letting the old and the new stand side by side. This isn't nostalgia, it's strategy. But here's the twist. Many of these projects were started before Traoré took power. The difference? Under his leadership, the timelines collapsed. What might have taken years is finishing in months. That's either a sign of efficient governance or, depending on your view, an unsustainable sprint fueled by political momentum. So here's my question for you, especially if you're watching from the US. Would you rather see your leaders promise big and move slow or push fast and risk burnout? Tell me in the comments because the debate here is far from over. And just when you think you've seen the heart of this campus, there's a part of it that feels more like an art gallery than a university. Step into the letters, arts and communication department, and the air changes. Murals spill across the walls, sculptures line the walkways, and there's a basketball court tucked right beside an amphitheater. It's not just a place for lectures, it's a living space for creativity. Here's something that caught me off guard. Many of the sculptures and installations here weren't commissioned from outside. They were designed and built by the students themselves. Imagine walking into your university library in the US and finding the art on display wasn't imported from a gallery, but created by your classmates. That sense of ownership changes the way you see a place. And then there's the architecture. Old, weathered lecture halls with thick walls and open windows stand right next to gleaming new laboratories. The material? Locally molded bricks and laterite stone. These aren't just cheaper, they're naturally cool in the heat, durable through decades, and easier to maintain. Compare that to American universities where climate control can cost millions each year in air conditioning alone. Despite the upgrades, the university refuses to cut down certain old trees, even if it means designing buildings around them. In a world where construction often comes first and the environment second, this reversal is almost radical. Now, here's my challenge to you, especially if you're from the US. Would you accept less glass and steel, less shiny new, if it meant lower costs, more sustainability, and deeper connection to place? I want to hear your take because this could flip how we think about campus design. And if you think the arts department is the most inspiring part of this campus, wait until you see who's watching over the students from the center square. At the heart of the campus, there's a place that feels almost like a crossroads of history. Statues stand in careful formation, each one telling a story, each one carrying a weight heavier than bronze or stone. Front and center is Nelson Mandela, a reminder that the struggle for freedom and justice stretches far beyond national borders. A few steps away, there's Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan leader whose politics divided the world but whose financial contributions left a permanent mark here. And yes, Barack Obama's face is here too, symbolizing, at least to some, the hope of a new kind of leadership on the global stage. Here's the twist. These figures aren't random. They represent a deliberate mix: African revolutionaries, global political icons, and local heroes, placed together as if to say that Burkina Faso's identity is both deeply African and unapologetically global. But it's impossible to ignore the controversy. In the US, the idea of placing Gaddafi alongside Mandela and Obama would ignite heated debate. Do you honor a person for their contributions, or do you judge them by the totality of their actions? This is a question that isn't just academic. It shapes how we build monuments, name schools, and write history books. From an American perspective, this kind of public space would likely be contested ground. We've seen statues removed in the dead of night, street names changed after decades, but here the presence of these figures sparks conversation, not erasure. And maybe that's the point. It's not about agreeing, it's about remembering. Now, I'm asking you, if you were walking through your old college campus and saw a monument to a controversial figure, would you want it torn down or kept as a reminder? Comment your answer, because I guarantee this topic will split the room. But this square isn't just about politics. Just beyond the statues, the open space turns into a stage, sometimes literally. Cultural festivals, theater performances, music events, all spilling into the night air. The line between lecture hall and community gathering place disappears, and in that space you see something rare. A university acting not just as a place to earn a degree, but as a living, breathing part of the city's cultural heartbeat. That's a lesson American universities, often walled off from their surrounding neighborhoods, could learn from. Still, the question lingers. Can a place carry this much political weight and still remain a space for free thought? That's what we'll test as we move toward the sports grounds, where the conversation takes a very different turn. Walk a few minutes from the main square and the sound changes. The chatter of classrooms fades, replaced by the rhythmic thump of a basketball on concrete, the sharp whistle of a referee, and bursts of cheering. This is one of the most well-equipped basketball courts in the country, and it's right here on campus. You might think sports are just an extracurricular here. They're not. In Burkina Faso, they're a statement. The court isn't just for games. It's a training ground for athletes who go on to represent the nation internationally. One name stands out: Hugues Fabrice Zango, a triple jump champion who took home Olympic medals and now holds a doctorate in civil engineering. In a country often portrayed through the lens of poverty, his success flips the narrative completely. The university doesn't just celebrate athletic talent. It actively integrates sports into its academic identity. Imagine if Harvard or Stanford designed their athletic programs not as side projects, but as pillars of national pride, tied directly to the school's public mission. That's what's happening here. And here's where it gets political. Sports in Burkina Faso aren't just games. They're diplomacy. Victories in track, football, and basketball become soft power tools, shaping how the world sees the country. From an American perspective, this feels familiar. Think of the Olympics during the Cold War, where every medal was a symbolic win for ideology as much as for the athlete. Now, the debate. Should universities be centers for national image building, or should they focus solely on academics? If you're from the US, where college sports can overshadow entire academic programs, you might already have strong opinions. Drop them below, because this is one of those no middle ground topics. If you believe sports should have a place in shaping national identity, like and share this video. If you think they distract from education, tell us why. But there's another layer to this campus life that goes beyond stadium lights and cheering crowds, one that happens quietly, in classrooms and labs where the stakes might be even higher than an Olympic final. And that's where we're headed next. Step inside the university's new research center for science and medicine, and the energy shifts again. There's no roar of a crowd here, only the low hum of equipment, the shuffle of lab coats, and the sharp scent of disinfectant. This facility was built after Ibrahim Traoré took office, and it's already changing how the country approaches healthcare and scientific study. In a nation where access to advanced medical care has been limited for decades, this lab isn't just a building, it's a lifeline. Here's a fact that might surprise you. The center's initial funding didn't come entirely from the government. A combination of state investment, private donations, and international partnerships fueled its construction. That mix is critical because it means the facility isn't entirely dependent on political cycles, something American institutions also rely on to maintain research independence. Many of the researchers here are alumni who studied abroad, some in France, some in Canada, a few even in the US, and chose to come back. Think about that. In a world where brain drain is the norm, Burkina Faso is actually reversing the flow. In America, we often talk about attracting global talent. Here, they're building conditions that bring their own talent home. From an American perspective, that's a sharp contrast. In the US, the conversation is often about keeping top graduates from leaving for Silicon Valley or Wall Street. In Burkina Faso, the fight is to make staying feel like the better choice. Now, here's the tension point. Can a developing country really compete with the salaries, technology, and infrastructure of wealthier nations? Or will passion and patriotism eventually collide with economic reality? If you think purpose can outweigh paychecks and keeping talent at home, hit like. If you believe money will always win in the end, share your view in the comments. But research here isn't just about medicine, it's about rethinking education itself. And the next place we're visiting proves that this university is as much about culture and identity as it is about textbooks and labs. Walk across the open courtyards here, and you'll hear a mix of sounds that could rival any international airport. French flows into English, which blends into German, Spanish, and half a dozen local languages, Mure, Dioula, Fulfulde. It's a constant code-switching dance, and for students here, it's not just about communication, it's identity. In some departments, you can walk into one class taught entirely in English, step next door to another in German, and end your day with a lecture in French. One student tells me about a classmate from Ghana who came here to study English literature. For her, the transition was easy until the French classes started. That's when the challenge set in. And yet, this multilingual reality is part of the design. It forces students to think beyond borders, to adapt constantly. Even slang becomes an art form. Students create coded languages by flipping syllables or replacing words entirely, a form of verbal graffiti that lets them talk in plain sight without outsiders catching on. In the US, you might compare it to the coded language used in certain subcultures, from jazz musicians in the 40s to gamers today. From an American perspective, this linguistic fluidity is both impressive and daunting. In the US, debates rage over bilingual education. Here, multilingualism isn't a political flashpoint, it's a survival skill. Tension point. Does this constant language shifting make students more adaptable, Or does it risk spreading them too thin in mastering any single field? If you believe multilingualism is the ultimate edge in today's world, drop a comment. If you think deep mastery matters more than versatility, let's hear your reasoning. But language is just one side of the cultural coin. The other is the way this campus weaves art, history, and public space into its everyday rhythm. And that brings us to the final chapter of our journey. As the sun drops low over the city, the road leading out of campus feels symbolic, lined with trees, bordered by both new and old buildings, and stretching toward an uncertain but ambitious horizon. The question isn't whether Burkina Faso is changing, it's whether this pace can last. Under Ibrahim Traoré, projects have moved from blueprint to reality at breakneck speed: airports, highways, universities, research centers. Supporters see it as proof that bold leadership can deliver results. Critics warn that speed without long-term planning is a recipe for burnout and instability. From an American perspective, this mirrors debates about infrastructure spending back home. Do you go big and fast, knowing some mistakes will happen? Or go slow and risk losing momentum to political gridlock? Many of the projects people credit to Traoré were started before his tenure. His true impact may not be starting them, but finishing them in record time. That's a different kind of leadership, one that thrives on acceleration rather than invention. Now the crossroads. Will these achievements inspire a generation to keep building? Or will they fade when political winds shift? Will universities like this continue to be engines of talent, culture, and national pride? Or will economic pressures force them to cut corners? If you believe Burkina Faso's transformation can be sustained, share this story. If you think it's a sprint that can't be kept up, tell us why in the comments. And if this journey has changed the way you see this country, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of Africa's story the world hasn't heard yet. Closing line: this isn't just development, this is a movement, and it's only just begun.